Jr. I mean, they just always seem to take out the best people, right? They always seem to take out the truth tellers and anybody that would give humanity a hope. So I guess to that extent, I'm shocked that President Trump is still alive and kicking, and God bless him for trying to do his best part to defeat the deep state.
Well, JFK Jr. was important in several respects, and I conducted the first independent investigation for my book. I talked to people that were there. I talked to JFK Jr. insiders who wanted to remain anonymous still, or still fearful. John F. Kennedy, what I found was that John F. Kennedy Jr. had a desire behind the scenes, and it was becoming more open. He had a quest to find out who killed his father, and that differentiated him from every other member of the Kennedy family, certainly his sister Caroline, who freaks out if somebody even mentions the assassination 55 years later. But John F. Kennedy Jr. wanted to know. He had almost like a Hamlet-type Shakespearean compulsion to avenge his father's death, and his magazine George was about to go into that area. Wayne Madsen, a very well-known alternative journalist, told me in an email, admitted that he was set to meet with John F. Kennedy Jr. the week after he died to become a new investigative journalist on the staff of George magazine to investigate specifically the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So just imagine the ramifications that would have had, because obviously the media couldn't ignore George magazine. They talked it up when he was the sexiest man alive and so forth. So clearly he was on a quest to do that. Now I go over the details of the alleged accident, and there's no question that the official story, as all official stories turn out to be, is just completely fake and phony, more fake news. The 9:39 p.m. phone call, we're told that his plane went into a death spiral at exactly 9:39 p.m. I have unedited coverage that was sent to me by another researcher in Texas, Scott Myers, who recorded it live from WCVB TV local in Boston. And I have hours of that coverage. But it was unedited. Later, researchers attempted to find that kind of local coverage, and they edited all references to the 9:39 p.m. phone call out because it's significant. They talked over and over again. UPI reported, ABC News reported it, that JFK Jr. contacted Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9:39 p.m., the exact moment we're told later that his plane was going into death spiral, saying all was calm, everything was fine. He was planning to drop off his sister-in-law at Martha's Vineyard Airport and then go on to Hyannisport for the wedding of Rory Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's youngest child, with his wife. So clearly, and then what's most important is that the Coast Guard sent a spokesman, a publicity officer, Todd Bergen, to do an interview. And I have that interview on tape. It was done with Susan Warnick, who is a local journalist there. He went into detail, talking again about that 9:39 p.m. phone call. Now later, when the Pentagon took over, when the bodies were found and the Pentagon took over, suddenly the 9:39 p.m. phone call went down the memory hole. All references to it were deleted. Suddenly there was no contact from JFK Jr. anymore. I tried to locate Todd Bergen, found his phone number, left a message for him. He never got back to me. I emailed Susan Warnick, the reporter that interviewed him 3 different times. Said, what did you think of this? You did an interview with this guy, and as typical journalists, they know to cover up. They know to clam up. They have no investigative zeal whatsoever. She should have been chomping at the bit. Hey, wait a minute. What is the Coast Guard doing sending a guy out here to talk about a phone call that never happened?
Let me just tell you, I want to just jump in and remind people how we see this happen time and time again with these Mockingbird mainstream media journalists. It just reminds me of Jane Stanley, who was reporting live from New York City with the BBC via satellite about the collapse of the Salomon Brothers building as World Trade Center 7 was still standing behind her. And while she was having that conversation via satellite, the satellite feed fails. And 20 minutes later, the building about which she was just speaking, saying it had already collapsed, then collapses at free fall speed. And of course, Jane Stanley doesn't want to talk about that now.
Because they can't. I mean, you see this in all these cases. But Steve Zabraka, who was the first local reporter on the scene, who also worked at that time for WCB TV, he shocked me because I emailed him without really giving away that I had any doubts about the official story, and he must have seen through it because he said, to be honest with you, nothing seemed right about that case. Something was wrong there. There were so many people on the scene, and I exchanged emails again. They're in the book. And he's very significant because he talked to a local reporter from the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, who early on there were reports in the media that a local reporter, they never named him, had seen an explosion in the sky. Again, at that time in that area, so clearly it had to do with JFK Jr.'s plane. and he was never identified. Steve Zabraka said, "I will swear in court that this guy existed." He gave me a description of him. I tried emailing the editor of the Martha's Vineyard Gazette. They claim to not even remember the story. Now, the Martha's Vineyard Gazette is a little, very tiny newspaper that gears to a local community. That's probably the biggest story they ever had in their existence. There's no way she doesn't remember that. So, very frustrating. But that's the kind of the problems that we face in investigating something like this. That we have, they're the reports change so much. I exchanged emails with Edward Meyer, who wrote the weather reports, the official weather conditions for the FAA. He was mad at the time. He lashed out at the media and said, "You guys are not telling the truth about anything," because what happened was the radar and people like Edward Meyer actually investigated it, showed that the weather conditions at the time were not bad at all. We kept hearing it was hazy, JFK Jr. was reckless, he should have never flown. That's all bull. That's contradicted by the actual evidence. And this guy was still mad when he emailed. He said nothing, and the readers can see the exact quote that I quote him in there. Nothing reported by the American media by this was accurate at all.
I want to weigh in just with a little bit of memory here, and you tell me if I have this correct. I recall this time so very well, and I recall the Mockingbird mainstream media really turning against JFK Jr. immediately and trying to disparage him as a reckless, inexperienced pilot flying at night, wasn't rated to be flying at night. And my understanding is that he was a very competent pilot, a very careful pilot, who almost always flew with a flight instructor, especially if he was going to fly at night. And then I recall some news bits about the possibility, and this gets a little gruesome, about divers locating the plane and the possibility of there having been a flight instructor on board that plane. Of course, the Mockingbird mainstream media tried to make it sound like there was no flight instructor. And then there's this whole theory that Bush Sr. was involved in the murder of John F. Kennedy, and Bush Jr. was involved in the murder of JFK Jr. I wonder if there's any truth in any of that.
Well, their early reports indicated that there was a fourth seat missing from the plane, and there were reports that there was a flight instructor on board. JFK did usually fly with a flight instructor. One of his flight instructors told the Orlando Sentinel he was again mad, and he got backed off later. But he said, no, this guy was a very qualified pilot. He was good. This was a flight easy for him to make. It was not difficult, but he kind of backed off. But he did appear in the Orlando Sentinel earlier on. And as for the Bush connections, John Hankey, there's a very good documentary out there called, I think it's The Assassination of John F. Kennedy Jr. I can't remember what the exact title is. Probably still out on YouTube. Hankey's done some good work. It's very entertaining, but I think he concentrates a little bit too much on Bush, much as I think the people that supposedly saw a picture of George H.W. Bush, who would have been very young at the time in 1963. I don't doubt that he was connected to the CIA. There's a letter about George Bush to the CIA and so forth. But I think he would have been a very kind of a low-level guy at his age at that time, even though his father was a president and he had some elite connections, I'm sure. He was Yale, Skull and Bones, and so forth. But I think these things are done above the level of politicians, much as the people that say LBJ was behind JFK's assassination. Again, he was a thoroughly corrupt politician. He had a body count probably second only to Clinton's, and he certainly would have approved of it and would have been, and was, I don't think, was delighted that JFK was assassinated so he could achieve his lifetime dream of being president. But I think these decisions are made above those levels. George W. Bush, had not been elected yet, was on the verge of getting elected. So certainly he would have had reason, much as Hillary. A lot of people connect JFK Jr. to the Clinton body count because there are indications that he might have challenged her for the Senate seat in New York that she went on to take. So clearly a lot of people, and Hillary, JFK Jr., people forget how this guy had none of the baggage that some of Robert Kennedy's children had, for instance. He had led a clean life. He had movie star looks. He was better looking than his father, for goodness sake. I mean, he just on looks alone, he probably would have gotten 80% of the female vote. And he just had charm. He's all accounts like his father. He was well liked behind the scenes. He just got along with everyone, treated the little people fine. And here, but he had this dangerous thing where he wanted to find out who killed his father. And I think that there was no way they were going to let him live. And as you mentioned, I remember when I first saw the helicopters flying around when he was reported missing, I knew there was no chance of him being found alive, because that's what happens to Kennedys, unfortunately. And I detail all their deaths in the book, and there are more unnatural deaths of the Kennedys than people even know. I mean, readers can, in-laws and things like that. It's just amazing and astonishing. It goes to it's a level of Greek tragedy, if it could possibly be. And I don't really understand, other than there is kind of a blood and water thing, I think, with the people that rule. As much as they love symbolism, I think they fear even someone like a Carolyn Kennedy today, who seems about as innocuous a threat as possible. She doesn't seem to have a bone in her body to go against the establishment, but she is the only surviving child of JFK. And I think that's why, for instance, when she was set to be named as the senator from New York to replace Hillary Clinton, they went on a campaign and they said, oh, she said, 150 times or something, stuff that they routinely clean up when they publish these interviews with inarticulate people that are less inarticulate. But she completely dropped out. She got the message, and she won't be heard from again politically. But the JFK Jr., I think, is one of the most important chapters in my book, because until I wrote about it, now another guy recently has written a book about it, I understand, but until I investigated, I think people they had to go by the early 1999 reports. There were some good, and even then, at that time, you had guys like John Quinn of Newshawk and John DiNardo, John Hankey, as I mentioned, Wayne Madsen, Anthony Hilder. But these were all people on the internet. We saw even then no one in the mainstream media, although we did have things like the Boston Globe that did question the very quick cremation of the Catholic Kennedy and his wife, which was very strange, and the fact that they did a very superficial kind of autopsy, whatever they did. And even the mainstream media questioned that. So very, very strange aspects to this death. I think because of what we know about what he was thinking behind the scenes and what he was planning to do, I don't think there's any doubt that he was eliminated, much as his father and uncle were.
Let me ask you this before we go, because I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up, because there are some, and among them are actually my friend Liz Crokin, who really has a belief that there's a possibility that JFK Jr. is alive and his death was faked. Now, as with everything as context, everything that we've just talked about, I don't personally think that there's a chance in the world that could be the case. How do you get one of the world's most famous men to just disappear for the last 20 years? Your thoughts? I mean, I guess it would be one of the most incredible stories in the history of the world if somehow JFK Jr. is tied to this Q White Hats movement, and we're going to take this thing back, and we're going to take this thing back for the Republic and the people. But we do need to keep in mind that during the president's inauguration, he did say, this is not just merely an exchange of power from one political party to another.
But we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
So I do believe the White Knight efforts are real. I just don't personally believe JFK Jr. is involved. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, boy, that would give it such a Hollywood Frank Capra type twist. I mean, I would love to think that JFK Jr. was behind the scenes, trying to help Trump drain the swamp and get rid of the deep state. But as you mentioned, yeah, it would be very far-fetched, I think, to believe that something like that could. Although, but again, knowing what we know of how these cover-ups work, I would hesitate to say impossible, because one thing we do know, just what I know from investigating, is the official story is impossible. So I know that he didn't die because of an accident. Now, it looks on the surface certainly that he did die, but again, we have to trust the people that found the bodies. We never, we didn't see, there were no footage of that really. The bodies were quickly cremated at sea, which is very, very strange and they had the establishment media I talked about that were on hand to provide absurd explanations for that, like that, well, the family didn't want him to have a grave site that would become a fodder for ghouls to desecrate. And as I mentioned, JFK's and RFK's graves have never been desecrated by ghouls. There was no reason for them to think that, but again, it seemed to be a very convenient, tailor-made excuse as to why. So I think the only indication that could possibly have any validity that he faked his own death would be the way that they kept the public away from even seeing the retrieval of the bodies and the wreckage, and the way they cremated and got rid of them so quickly. I find that, but again, that I think that's more likely that it's just part of the the assassination process, and they just wanted to get rid of the evidence real quickly, as they're wont to do. But I'm familiar with those theories, and I'd like to think they were true, because the guy was 38 years old. It's just an awful tragedy. He didn't even live as long as his uncle or his father. So, and he had such a bright future, and I think that the world would have been vastly different if he had, because I think it would have been a completely different Democratic Party, I think, with somebody like him in there.
Boy, it sure absolutely would have been. He's the antithesis to Hillary Clinton, and they're both considered Democrats, but she's a Soros Marxist Democrat, and he was his father's type of Democrat, right? A Democrat for the people. I wonder how the Democratic Party has gone so far off the rails as to allow what's happened to it to have happened, because it is really, really a pathetic shame. But I'll say this, it's interesting you leave the door open on that, because boy, wouldn't it be wonderful to find out that, yes, even back then there were some white knights in the military that wanted to try to preserve the republic, and they knew that sooner or later the deep state would take a hit out, would whack JFK Jr. So they made sure to put in protective measures to prevent that from happening. Boy, you're right. That would be a Hollywood story for all ages, wouldn't it? The best movie ever.
It's a Wonderful Life. Boy, it would be such a feel-good story, and it would give hope. But again, I don't think it's very likely, but the average person out there who isn't awake thinks everything we're talking about is unlikely and impossible. So and we know that obviously that these huge cover-ups can be instituted, and these things can happen. Witnesses can be killed constantly. I mean, you can read of, just during Hillary Clinton's candidacy, the amount of people that died, the guy that dropped the barbell on his throat while he was working out. Another guy that dropped dead of a heart attack after he served the papers about the DNC, rigging the primaries, dropped dead at 39 or something.
Sean Lucas, I believe, was his name. Is that right, Sean Lucas? But the other death that comes to mind is Scalia. And what did the deep state do? Immediately got his body, cremated his body, no autopsy.
Yep.
Yeah, no. It's always fishy around the deaths of these people who, are opposed in any way, shape, or form to the Marxist Democratic Party or the deep state. All right, so I'm glad I mentioned Scalia. I meant to mention that. I thought there was something else I wanted to mention, but we've covered a lot of stuff here. Why don't you tell people about the book, how to get it? It's called Hidden History, and it would be a very, very good Christmas present for folks to hand out to their loved ones.
Oh, I hope so. It's done very well. It was the bestseller. It was #1 a couple times in several different categories in Amazon. The paperback edition has a foreword by Roger Stone, and but it also has blurbs by Cindy Sheehan on the left and Cynthia McKinney on the left. So it's a very unbiased look, I think, at every administration in the years since 1963. I cover, you mentioned a lot of the subjects in there. I didn't leave too much out. I realized I might have left a few things out later, but I covered as much as I could, every significant political event. And people have told me, so many people have told me that it will help to wake them up, because it's nice to have everything in one. It's like the original title was not expose, the subtitle was encyclopedia. And I think that really is fitting, because it's you can begin it anywhere. People have told me, that you can begin at the chapter on JFK Jr. or Oklahoma City, whatever you want. You can work back. You can go, because it does read like an encyclopedia. I analyze each event. I try to tell the true story and the way the narrative changed, and the unnatural deaths that are associated with almost all of these events and have been forgotten. And I focus again and again on, if there's a subtext to the books, it's the failure of our mainstream media in every one of these events to do any kind of investigative reporting. And that's why we're seeing the way they treat Trump and the way they react to even things like saying I'm a nationalist, or we might want to get rid of illegal aliens or something, illegal immigrants, something like that. It's not anything new for them. They react. They are. I compare them to Pravda and TASS journalists at the height of the Soviet Union, but the difference is the Russians at that time were smart enough to realize they were being lied to, and this is a state agency. Too many Americans don't seem to realize, and they think people like Jim Acosta and people like that, and Don Lemon, that these are actual journalists, that these are not just talking heads for the state, which is what they are. But my book is readily available on Amazon. It was published by Skyhorse Publishing, courageous publishers. Published my third book will be out with them next year, which is going to be called Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics. 1776 and 1963. So we'll go over the earlier events. Hopefully we can talk about that now. But in this case, you can find a ton of stuff on the JFK assassination, including my own personal experiences investigating it, all the way through the JFK Jr., all the way through the Obama years. This was before Trump, so Trump is, I don't know if Trump's even mentioned it in history, which is hard to believe. A book was published in 2014 without his name in it, but that's how quickly he catapulted into the political scene, that he really wasn't relevant politically to be talking about at that time. I don't think anybody foresaw him as the president of the United States.
No, they sure didn't, but we are, I think, very lucky. Our cup is at least half full because the Wicked Witch, the deep state puppet known as Hillary Clinton, is not in the White House, and instead she is being investigated for her hardcore crimes tied to the Clinton Foundation, and that is just scratching the surface. Guys, get the book. It's called Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups in American politics. Oh, and one last thing, Donald. As you know, the CIA is the one that coined the term conspiracy theorist to try to poison the well against anybody who would question the official story of John F. Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah, the infamous 1967 memo that was it talked about the critics of the Warren Report. Yeah, people can, and that's readily available, I believe, online too. I quote from it in Hidden History. People need to look at that and realize this was 1967, and it can apply to, as you noted, beyond the Warren Report, because at that time they were mainly concerned with these critics, these citizen critics. As again, even as with everything else, there wasn't really there were a couple local Dallas reporters like Jim Mars that did good work on it originally. But other than that, no one in the mainstream media investigated the Kennedy assassination. They all poo-pooed this. It was all done by citizen activists, average people they came from all walks of life, chicken farmers, things like that, World Health Organization workers. These were the people that did all the investigation that the mainstream media didn't. And I think the CIA perhaps didn't know they were foreseeing what would happen in the future with all these other issues. But the language they use in there can be applied to anything. When they talk about use, and people have to read it to see. They advise on how, and they talk about using our assets in the media. And we know about Operation Mockingbird, even to today, when you look at people like Anderson Cooper, who admits to being a CIA intern in college, and look at his so-called reporting, and understand that we don't know how many others that have not acknowledged that they were recruited into the CIA during their college days, because the CIA does have a very strong, and always has had a strong college intern program. How many of these people graduate to the MIDI? I saw some reports, and I don't know the specifics of it, where people were talking about a bunch of Democratic congressmen that were affiliated with the CIA that got elected in the last election. I haven't looked into that, but it doesn't surprise me, and I think that's the reason why all our intelligence agencies still have top secret budgets. So when anybody talks about that, not only do we not know what they're doing in these intelligence agencies often, we don't know how much money they're spending, and as taxpayers, we at least ought to have the right to know what their budgets are.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind, guys, as you think about the Mockingbird mainstream media aligned against us and aligned against truth, CNN pays Anderson Cooper $12 million a year to essentially spew deep state talking points. So as you consider the 55th anniversary of the murder of President John F. Kennedy, today on Thanksgiving, November 22nd, 2018, say a prayer for truth and for justice, and consider Luke chapter 8, verse 17, for there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the light. Our guest has been Donald Jeffries. The book is Hidden History. Thank you so much, Donald.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me. No contact from JFK Jr. anymore. I tried to locate Todd Bergen, found his phone number, left a message for him. He never got back to me. I emailed Susan Warnick, the reporter that interviewed him 3 different times. Said, what did you think of this? She did an interview with this guy, and as typical journalists, they know to cover up. They know to clam up. They have no investigative zeal whatsoever. She should have been chomping at the bit. Hey, wait a minute. What is the Coast Guard doing sending a guy out here to talk about a phone call that never happened?
Let me just tell you, I want to just jump in and remind people how we see this happen time and time again with these Mockingbird mainstream media journalists. It just reminds me of Jane Stanley, who was reporting live from New York City with the BBC via satellite about the collapse of the Solomon Brothers building as World Trade Center 7 was still standing behind her. And while she was having that conversation via satellite, the satellite feed fails. And 20 minutes later, the building about which she was just speaking, saying it had already collapsed, then collapses at free fall speed. And of course, Jane Stanley doesn't want to talk about that now.
Because they can't. You see this in all these cases. But Steve Zabraka, who was the first local reporter on the scene, who also worked at that time for WCB TV, he shocked me because I emailed him without really giving away that I had any doubts about the official story, and he must have seen through it because he said, to be honest with you, nothing seemed right about that case. Something was wrong there. There were so many people on the scene, and I exchanged emails again. They're in the book. And he's very significant because he talked to a local reporter for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, who early on there were reports in the media that a local reporter, they never named him, had seen an explosion in the sky. Again, at that time in that area, so clearly it had to do with JFK Jr.'s plane. Through it, because he said, to be honest with you, nothing seemed right about that case. Something was wrong there. There were so many people on the scene, and I exchanged emails again. They're in the book. And he's very significant because he talked to a local reporter for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, who early on there were reports in the media that a local reporter, they never named him, had seen an explosion in the sky. Again, at that time in that area, so clearly it had to do with JFK Jr.'s plane. And he was never identified. Steve Zabraka said, I will swear in court that this guy existed. He gave me a description of him. I tried emailing the editor of the Martha's Vineyard Gazette. They claim to not even remember the story. Now, the Martha's Vineyard Gazette is a little, very tiny newspaper that gears to a local community. That's probably the biggest story they ever had in their existence. There's no way she doesn't remember that. So, very frustrating. But that's the kind of the problems that we face in investigating something like this. That we have, The reports change so much. I exchanged emails with Edward Meyer, who wrote the weather reports, the official weather conditions for the FAA. He was mad at the time. He lashed out at the media and said, you guys are not telling the truth about anything, because what happened was the radar and people like Edward Meyer actually investigated it, showed that the weather conditions at the time were not bad at all. We kept hearing it was hazy, JFK Jr. was reckless, he should have never flown. That's all bull. That's contradicted by the actual evidence. And this guy was still mad when he emailed. He said nothing, and the readers can see the exact quote that I quote him in there. Nothing reported by the American media by this was accurate at all.